When it comes to consistency, I don't think a series has done it better than Resident Evil. I think I've made it pretty apparent that I'm a huge fan of not only survival horror, but the Resident Evil series in particular. It's a huge testament to the series' quality over the years that if you ask any fan what their favorite game is, they will likely give you a different answer. Now, not every game has been perfect, but for the most part, each game has been reviewed, rated, and beloved just as much as the next. And with Capcom on such a win streak with their Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4 remakes being huge successes, plus the recent announcement of Resident Evil 9 Requiem, it seems like this series in particular can do no wrong. Except they have. Twice. Coming off of the monstrous success of Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 5 had atmospheric expectations. I think it's a very Breath of the Wild to Tears of the Kingdom kind of thing, where the expectations were so unbelievably high that Capcom had to make a near-perfect game to satiate the fans' bloodlust for shitty cameras. And unfortunately, Resident Evil 5 wasn't even close to what fans were looking for. Resident Evil 5 wasn't just a step away from what fans expected, it was a fucking marathon away. The slow creeping dread of earlier titles was replaced with action-heavy sequences, over-the-top set pieces, and a story that felt more like a Hollywood blockbuster than a survival horror game. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it a bad game, actually far from it. In fact, there's a strong argument to be made that Resident Evil 5 is a solid co-op action title. And I hate this argument, but I'll use it here. It's not a bad game, just a bad Resident Evil game. And honestly, I kind of agree with this. The tone shifted. The pacing changed. And while Chris Redfield bitch-slapping boulders into submission has become one of the most iconic moments in the franchise, though maybe not for the right reasons,
this sucks.
It perfectly encapsulates just how far the series had strayed from its horror roots, which is why it just failed to deliver what Resident Evil fans had come to expect. Resident Evil is a very interesting series that has almost perfectly blocked off eras. The first 3 Resident Evil games have a similar style, with the fixed camera being the biggest design choice here. Resident Evil 4 through 6 switched to a more action-focused third-person shooter with the ever-famous tank controls, with 6 more or less abandoning those controls, but no one gives a f*** about that game, so I refuse to acknowledge it.
Resident Evil 6.
This is the worst!
I don't think any of you understand how much this game breaks my heart because I bought a PS4 for this game.
Whoa, what?
And now Resident Evil 7 through the newly announced Requiem, which will surely end up on my year-end list next year. But the era we want to focus on is that 4 to 6 era because I think this was a catalyst in getting 5 and 6, which are widely considered the weakest in the series. Resident Evil 4 is a landmark video game. It's an absolute masterclass in pacing and atmosphere. Yes, the camera is a struggle and it takes some getting used to, but even going back and playing this in modern times, it adds so much depth to the horror aspect of the game. I'd like to think of it as less of a weird design choice, even though that's most likely what it was. I'd like to think of it more as a nod to the very first Resident Evil. The camera being as shitty in Resident Evil 4 adds to the fear of the unknown. Turning around while aiming is slow. Moving while aiming is impossible, so things are more likely to jump scare you. This game is beloved by many, including myself. It consistently ranks very highly on best shooters of all time or even best games of all time lists. It perfectly balanced tense exploration, combat, and disturbing atmospheres. Because of the massive success of the game, the question became, how do you follow up a game that revolutionized the genre itself? Announced in July of 2005 and released in March of 2009, Resident Evil 5 was pretty quickly denounced as the worst in the series so far. Despite receiving favorable reviews from critics, many fans lamented over a specific aspect of the game that we will talk about momentarily. Because I wanted to re-experience and truly see what people were so angry over, I decided to replay the game to have a fresh mindset for this video. And to get the best experience, I invited a good friend to join me in my playthrough. Voyan.
Sup?
Hey, are you bored? Do you want to play Resident Evil 5? Yeah! Now, in retrospect, I probably could have played with any of my other friends like John, Fizzle, or Fookuh, who have a larger repertoire of Resident Evil knowledge and won't immediately be repulsed by tank controls. But there was something kind of charming and fun about working together with someone who isn't familiar with Resident Evil or even shooters as a whole. It was almost like escorting my own Ashley through the game. But even at the end, Voyan was holding his own and even made some stellar plays that helped keep us from replaying annoying sections over and over. I think that this is where the game shines the most. Playing this game was some of the most fun I've had with a multiplayer game since Helldivers 2. The co-op allows for some independent playstyles. Voyan preferred playing the game with SMGs and automatic weapons, which is the opposite of me. I prefer using the handgun and semi-automatic rifles. Because of this, sharing ammo became a really nice experience. Voyan was always available to share handgun ammo, and I would always give him my SMG ammo. There were sections where we would have to work together directly though, where maybe one person would have to hop onto a higher vantage point to complete an objective, while the other player would stay at the bottom and provide cover fire from below. Since this game is pretty generous with checkpoints and save points, dying became less frustrating and more comedic, with us sharing a laugh if someone died. Protendo?
How often do you see it?
The TV guy. Dude, you immediately let yourself die again.
What do you mean let yourself? I just spawned in! I didn't do anything!
Oh god.
What do you mean let yourself? I turned on the game and then I
Spawned and died, spawned, died.
Money and treasures are shared between both parties, so rather than fight each other for money for upgrades, it felt easier and more cooperative to defeat enemies and bosses. The only time I felt any amount of competition was at the end of each chapter when it showed you your grades. If you have a friend and 2 copies of this game, it's absolute multiplayer bliss. However, as fun as the cooperative gameplay can be, there's a reason that Resident Evil 5 still feels like an identity crisis. The core problem isn't the gameplay per se, it's the fact that it feels like it was trying to become something it never should have been. And that's where the action over horror shift becomes not just a design choice, but a complete betrayal of what made Resident Evil so iconic in the first place. While Resident Evil 4 had its action-heavy moments, it balanced those out with moments of intense isolation. The environments were creepy, the enemies were terrifying, and the atmosphere was dense. But in Resident Evil 5, there's a noticeable change in tone. You're no longer in the dark, oppressive corridors of the Spencer Mansion, or even the eerie village square of the village in Resident Evil 4. Instead, you're traipsing through wide-open spaces in Africa, fighting hordes of enemies under the blazing sun. The game has an almost arcade-like pacing, with constant action sequences that don't allow much room for tension to build. The survival horror that defined the series was traded for a more run-and-gun approach, one that, while fun in its own right, doesn't really match the original Resident Evil spirit. One thing that defined early Resident Evil titles was their use of darkness and lack of visibility to enhance the horror themes. Even in Resident Evil 4's brighter moments, most of the time, the game still felt desolate and scary. Resident Evil 5 is primarily set in brighter environments, with the African sun shining through every nook and cranny. Allegedly, the reason for this is that director Jun Takeuchi, I am so sorry, noticed that with enhanced and advanced hardware, they could make more detailed environments. And while Resident Evil as a franchise has always had really awesome and detailed environments, I think that games like Gears of War showed that on the same hardware, games' environments could still look varied and detailed even in low lighting. So Kyler the lawyer will object and say that this was just a weird design choice. The worst part is that it seems like Capcom tried to reconcile the shift by slapping on the same zombie enemies and virus outbreak story beats, but it all feels more like a backdrop rather than the driving force behind the game. Yes, you're still fighting infected creatures, but it's more about mowing down enemies in an exciting way than it is about surviving a nightmare. The horror has been replaced by action movie spectacle, and the game starts to feel like a hybrid of Resident Evil and Call of Duty, which personally I don't think is a good mix for a series that's always been about atmosphere and tension. And that brings us to the most controversial part of Resident Evil 5. Its narrative, and more or less the portrayal of its setting. Resident Evil has always had a relationship with global pandemics and outbreaks, but the setting in Africa raises some serious ethical and cultural questions, especially in the context of the game's time of release. The game has been criticized for its depiction of African locales and characters, with some calling it out for racial insensitivity and perpetuating harmful stereotypes. It's an issue that went largely unaddressed in the early 2000s, but upon retrospect, it's hard to ignore that a game about a plague in Africa might not have been the best choice for a series that was struggling to find its footing. Like I said in my recent remakes video, I think it may be because the developers just didn't know how to handle bioterrorism without veering into white guilt territory, but also, who the f am I to say? I'm a white dude from New York, so I'll leave this to those who are more equipped to talk about this. But even then, the game still seems split between trying to be socially aware and also being a video game. There's an odd contrast between Chris Redfield, a literal American action hero fighting infected locals, and the story trying to frame the situation as an international health crisis. There is an attempt to dive into bioterrorism themes, but much like the gameplay, it doesn't come together as effectively as it could have. The beauty of earlier Resident Evil games was their ability to mix action with the visceral horror of being utterly out of control in an unknown environment. But by Resident Evil 5, the survival aspect felt watered down. Chris, the guy who once had to fight for survival in a zombie-infested mansion, is now a walking tank, dispatching enemies and boulders with what seems like little effort. The weight of the stakes, the feeling that you are always on the edge of collapse, just one wrong step away from death. All of this had been replaced by bravado, machismo, and some Michael Bay explosions. Now, let's not get it twisted. Resident Evil 5 is still a ton of fun. The co-op mode, as I mentioned earlier, makes for one of the best multiplayer experiences in the franchise. There's a certain charm to it, and it's clear that Capcom wanted to create a more dynamic experience. But ultimately, it's a Resident Evil game in name only. There are elements here that will always be beloved, like the decent visuals and the fun, if somewhat mindless combat and boulders. But when you stack it against its predecessors, it's hard to ignore that this was Capcom's attempt to appease an audience that had moved away from the horror genre and into full-blown action territory. This is a game where the pacing, the tone, and the combat are all pretty indicative of a series that was trying to figure out where it fit into the new world of gaming. Should it continue down its survival horror roots? Or should it embrace the evolution of gaming into pure action territory? Resident Evil 5 tried to blend both, but in doing so, it ended up muddying what made Resident Evil great in the first place. Now, stripping away the story and noise about how Resident Evil isn't Resident Evil anymore, I think it's not nearly as bad as people remember it. I remember while Voyan and I were playing over Discord, several of my friends hopped in and were quick to remind us that this game is bad and unfun and how they want to bang Shep. But I think they're misconstruing the gameplay for the story. I think the gameplay is still solid here. I mean, it's largely unchanged from Resident Evil 4 and still requires the same skill set and item management, even though I found items to be in overabundance, watering down the actual survival aspect. I think this is one of the easier Resident Evil games, but I don't think that should diminish the fun of the game. Not every game needs to be Dark Souls. Even with all of this, Resident Evil games have a knack for making even the most basic mechanics feel satisfying. And while Resident Evil 5 doesn't lean as hard into the atmospheric dread, it still has that pulse-pounding tension when you know a big battle is coming, and you're not sure if you've stocked up enough ammo. This is particularly true in the context of playing with a partner, which I believe is the most effective way to play the game. For a lot of people, Resident Evil 5 is the Resident Evil game that they experienced with a friend. The game is clearly designed with that in mind. When your partner can hold their own and you both share resources, it becomes less about resource hoarding and more about executing strategies together. It's a different kind of tension. Not the fear of running out of supplies, but the fear of not coordinating with your partner properly and getting overwhelmed. That is when the game works. Yeah, so minor complaint here, but Voyan and I played this on Steam, and we encountered a boss that we spent an hour and a half on, and we were confused as to what we were doing wrong. As a child, I don't remember this being a roadblock, and I was perplexed as to why after bulldozing our way through the game earlier. After like 4 attempts, we both mutually agreed to search for a guide and see if there was something we missed. Turns out, because we had the game in 60 frames per second, obviously, the boss was invincible because of the difference in when the game was designed. For 30 frames per second, it made the boss difficult to beat. I don't know, I don't work for Best Buy. But after dropping this to 30 frames for this boss specifically, we were able to beat the boss with little resistance.
It says the fight is bugged. You have to cap FPS to 30 for the flame damage to work. The game was originally designed with a 30 FPS limit, and this is one thing Capcom never finished to fix when removing the FPS limit on PC.
There's no way that's real. Oh my god, Casey.
That is so funny. How much longer would we have done this?
That's crazy. I knew we weren't. I knew we were doing it right. Is the thing. Like I was getting frustrated because I knew we were doing it correctly. Not necessarily the game's fault, I suppose, just annoying and a little anecdote I wanted to include. Disregarding our stupidity, I think that this game has been unfairly overshadowed by its more narrative-driven flaws. If you approach Resident Evil 5 as a co-op shooter, it does what it sets out to do exceptionally well. You're not just running around with a friend shooting at zombies, you're working together to strategize and share resources, and it turns into a fast-paced, dynamic experience. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that Resident Evil 5 holds up as a solid co-op experience. It's not perfect, but it's still a damn good time. It may not scratch that same survival horror itch that older entries did, but sometimes a more action-focused game is exactly what you're in the mood for. And as I mentioned earlier, not every game has to be a Dark Souls-esque ordeal of constant survival and panic. Sometimes it's just okay to have fun with the mechanics and let the action flow. And for better or for worse, Resident Evil 5 set the stage for what would come next. The even more action-oriented Resident Evil 6, and then, of course, the rebirth of the series with Resident Evil 7. But that is a story for another time. I'm gonna go play session.
1.